Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start, I want you to hold one number in your head, 96. Not a countdown to an explosion, not a movie clock. 96 hours of emergency leave, granted by a colonel who read a child's handwriting twice and then closed a folder very slowly. This is a story about a man whose entire profession was doors. 21 years of them. He could look at a slab of steel and tell you where it was weak, how it was hung, what it was pretending to be. And the one door he never thought to measure was the one in his own house, the one with his wife's family standing on the other side of it, smiling. What makes this story worth your time isn't the raid, it's the paperwork. Because the thing that actually destroyed these people wasn't a man kicking in a gate at midnight. It was a 14-year-old boy's name appearing on a federal timesheet for 61 hours of work in a week he had already been dead for 4 days. That's the part nobody expects. There is an entire industry in this country built on the idea that a frightened parent will sign anything, and that a child who is far enough away can be described however you like. This one time, the child was describing them back. Stay with me to the end, because the last thing this father says to his wife is 9 words long, and it lands harder than anything he does with his hands. Thatcher Blaylock had a rule he taught every young man who came through his troop, and he taught it the same way every time, with his palm flat against whatever door happened to be in front of them. A door is a lie, he'd say. It's a lie about what's on the other side. Our whole job is calling the lie. They called him Thatch, and by the summer he turned 44, he had been a breacher in the Army's Special Mission Unit for 21 years. Not a kicker. He hated that word. Kicking was what men did in movies, right before they got shot through the wall. Thatch measured. He read hinges the way other men read faces. He carried a folding rule in his kit for 18 years, passed 4 different sets of body armor, and a divorce he didn't see coming. And by the end of it, he had put charges on something close to 400 doors, most of them in Fallujah. In a season of his life, he described to exactly no one. He was not a loud man. That was the thing people got wrong about him. His neighbors in Rolla Springs thought he was a contractor of some kind. Quiet, polite, always up before the sun. His son Brees, 13 that year, had figured out by the age of 9 that his father's silence wasn't emptiness. It was inventory. His dad was always taking inventory. You count everything, Brees told him once, in the truck. Everything that holds is holding something, Thatch said. You should know what. He had married Ansley Sherrod when he was 26 and she was 23, in a chapel outside Fayetteville, with 4 of his teammates standing up in the back in dress blues. Ansley was quick and funny and she laughed with her whole face, and for years Thatch believed he had done the single luckiest thing a man in his line of work could do, which was to find a person who did not flinch when he came home with nothing he could say about why his hands were shaking. He should have paid more attention to her family. The Sherrods came out of Ammons County, Utah, high desert country where the towns had 2 streets and 1 grocery, and everybody was somebody's cousin. Lorene Sherrod, the mother, was 74, and had the softest voice in 3 counties, and used it like a scalpel. She said the word boundaries, the way some people say a prayer, and Thatch had noticed, at the very first Thanksgiving he ever spent with them, that nobody in that dining room contradicted her, not once, not even about the weather. There were 3 brothers. Talmadge, the eldest, was 52, and had spent 19 years as a corrections lieutenant at a state facility outside Cavender, before he retired early and reinvented himself as something he called a behavioral architect. He wore his hair combed back, and he never raised his voice, and he had a way of standing with his hands folded in front of him that made people volunteer information. He liked the phrase, loving consequence. Cormac, 48, was the smooth one. He had a real estate license, 3 trucks, and a company called Safe Passage Youth Services that would arrive at your house at 3 in the morning and take your child out of his bed for a flat fee of $4,200. And then there was Barrow, 39, built like a piece of farm equipment, with a habit of laughing at things that weren't funny. Barrow ran the cruise. Barrow was the reason a boy from Barstow, California, stopped waking up. Together, the 3 of them owned Bright Mesa Ranch, 1,600 acres on the eastern shoulder of Dorrance Mesa, and the brochure they mailed to desperate parents in 11 states called it a discipline program for young men who have run out of second chances. Thatch had been there exactly twice, once in 2019 for a barbecue, where he counted 11 boys in matching gray shirts, standing in a line by the water trough for the entire time the adults ate, and asked Talmadge about it. "They're earning," Talmadge said. "Earning what?" "The privilege of sitting." Talmadge smiled at him the way you smile at a child at a grown-up's table. "It's structure, Thatcher. It's the kindest thing anyone's ever done for them." The second time was 2022, and it was shorter, and it ended with Thatch standing at the edge of a stock barn looking at a length of aircraft cable running the length of a bunk rail with cuffs crimped into it at even intervals, 22 of them, spaced like fence posts. He asked what it was. Barrow told him it was a stock line for the horses. Thatch had built a career on knowing when a thing was pretending to be another thing. He looked at the cuffs, and the wear on the cuffs, and the height of the rail, and the concrete under it, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. And here is the part he would carry for the rest of his life, the part he would say out loud in a courtroom 2 years later, with his hands flat on the rail in front of him. He said, "Huh," and then he got in his truck and drove home, because Ansley was in the car, because it was her family, because he had 4 days left before he flew out, because he was tired in a way that 39 months of combat rotations makes a man tired, and because it is astonishing what a person can decide not to see when seeing it would cost them their whole life. "I had 181 seconds where I knew," he said later, "and I spent them being polite." The deployment was supposed to be his last. 9 months in Western Iraq, an advisory rotation, the kind of tour they give a man they're preparing to put behind a desk. He signed the paperwork in February. Bryce took it hard in the specific way 13-year-olds take things hard, which is to say, sideways. He stopped talking at dinner. He got caught with a vape in the 8th grade bathroom and served 2 days of in-school suspension. He put a fist through the drywall in the laundry room after a shouting match with his mother about a phone. Thatch patched the drywall himself the night before he flew out. He made Brees hold the tape. "You're angry," he said. "I'm not." "You are, and that's fine. Angry is information." He smoothed the compound with his thumb. "But listen to me. Anger is a tool with a handle on both ends. Every time you pick it up, you decide which end you're holding. You understand?" "Sure. Say it back to me." Brees sighed the way boys do. "Both ends. Both ends." Thatch put his hand on the back of his son's neck. 9 months. "I'll call Sundays. You keep your sister laughing." Ruthie was 7. She had a stuffed jackrabbit named Corn Chip, and she believed her father worked on airplanes. He flew out on the 28th of March. 6 weeks later, Ansley Blaylock sat at her kitchen table at 11 at night with a stack of paper in front of her, a glass of wine, and her mother's voice on speakerphone. The paper was an enrollment packet. 91 pages, prepared by a lawyer in Cavender named Fitz Ledford, and page 14 of it was an arbitration and non-disclosure agreement that said, in language a normal person's eye slides right off of, that whatever happened at Bright Mesa Ranch, you would never talk about it publicly, and you would never sue in an actual courtroom. "You're doing the loving thing," Lorene told her. "You're doing the hard, loving thing, and someday he'll thank you for it. Thatcher won't understand." "Thatcher isn't here," Lorene said. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" Ansley signed the packet at 11:40. She signed the transport authorization at 11:41. She wrote a check for $10,900, which was 3 months' tuition and the transport fee, and she put it in an envelope, and she went to bed in the house her husband was paying for while he was 9,000 miles away. They came at 3:15 in the morning on the 9th of May. 2 men from Safe Passage Youth Services, in black polos with an embroidered logo of a dove, which Cormac had paid a design student $200 for. The driver was a man named Merrill Kilbourne, who had been fired from a county ambulance service in 2016 and had found, in the private transport business, a career with no licensing board at all. They rang the bell. Ansley opened the door, and then went and stood in the kitchen with her back to the hallway, which is what the intake instructions told parents to do. "Your presence prolongs the resistance," page 6 said. "Trust the professionals." Brees woke up with a flashlight in his face and a stranger's hand on his ankle. He fought. He was 13, 5'4", 118 pounds, and he fought like his father's son, which is to say he went for the door and not the man. He got 7 feet down the hallway. Kilbourne put him on the carpet in the hall outside the bathroom and zip-tied his wrists in front of him with a cable tie, and Bryce screamed for his mother, and his mother was 11 feet away with the tap running so she couldn't hear it. Ruthie came out of her room, 7 years old, holding her jackrabbit. She watched two men carry her brother out the front door in his underwear and a t-shirt with a cartoon shark on it. She would remember and repeat to a federal agent 15 months later, in the flat, precise way small children report atrocities, that her brother said, "Ruthie, tell Dad," 3 times. Then the house was quiet, and Ansley came out and made her daughter Coco and told her that Bryce had gone to a special school in the mountains where they were going to help him with his choices. That was the last time anyone in that family used the word school and got away with it. Bright Mesa Ranch sat at the end of 11 miles of county gravel, and the first thing you saw was the gate. Talmadge had spent $9,000 on that gate, welded steel pipe, a hand-forged arch, and the ranch name in letters 2 feet high, cut from quarter-inch plate. It was the single most photographed object on the property, because it was in the brochure, and in the video on the website, and behind Lorene Sherrod's shoulder in every Family Day photograph she ever posed for. Intake happened in a metal building that used to be a machine shop. Bryce's clothes went into a labeled bin. His hair went into a trash bag on the floor, clipped to a quarter-inch. He was given 2 gray t-shirts, 2 pairs of gray shorts, canvas boots a size and a half too big, and a laminated card with his name and the number 39 on it. He was told he was a level 0, that at level 0 he had 4 privileges: water, food, the ground, and the truth, and that the truth privilege meant he was permitted to answer questions. He was told he could not write a letter until level 3, and that most boys reached level 3 in 4 to 6 months. He was told his mother had already been informed that he would be manipulative. That was the phrase Talmadge Sherrod had built an empire on. Every complaint a child made was pre-labeled, before he made it. As evidence of the disease the program was there to cure. Bright Mesa's parent handbook, page 22, said it plainly: expect your son to allege mistreatment. This is the single most reliable indicator that the program is working. You have to sit with the design of that for a second. It is not sloppiness. It is engineering. They built a machine in which a child's testimony was automatically converted into proof of the necessity of the machine. The boys called the stock barn the nightline. 22 positions, aircraft cable through crimped sleeves, a padded ankle cuff at each station, cable locked at 9:15 and unlocked at 4:45. Talmadge's written policy called it nocturnal accountability and justified it as an anti-elopement measure, because 2 boys had walked off the property in 2021 and one of them had spent a night in a wash in February and lost the tips of 3 fingers. That story got told to every new boy on his first night. See what happens when you run. Duffy Crosby was 15 and had been at Bright Mesa for 3 years and 2 months, which made him the senior resident on the mesa. He was the one who taught Bryce the rules, in a whisper, lying on his back 6 feet away with his ankle in a cuff. Rule 1, never be the first to stop working. Rule 2, never be the last to finish eating. Rule 3, if Barrow says your name, you already lost. Rule 4, and Duffy said this one twice: when they ask you how you feel, the only correct answer is grateful. Cricket Hobbs was 12. He was the smallest boy on the property, and he'd been sent there by a stepfather in Boise for setting fire to a mattress, and he cried for the first 11 nights, quietly, with his forearm over his mouth, and on the 12th night he stopped and never did it again, which Duffy said was worse. Sim Tennant was 16 and enormous, and had the flattest eyes Bryce had ever seen on a person. Sim had been at the ranch 19 months. Sim was the one who told Bryce about the boys who graduated and the boys who transferred, and how nobody ever got a letter from either kind. And then there was the work, because here is the thing that made Bright Mesa Ranch different from the ordinary cruelty of the industry it belonged to, and here is the thing that would eventually take the whole family apart at the joints. The boys did not just do chores, the boys were a workforce. 12 miles west of the ranch, on the far side of the mesa, was public land, and on that public land there was a contract. Dorrance Fuels and Forestry LLC, sole member Talmadge R. Sherrod, held a hazardous fuels reduction subcontract, thinning juniper and pinyon, cutting fire breaks, hauling slash, stacking burn piles. Wildfire mitigation, good, necessary work that the West cannot get enough of, funded with public money, billed at $38 an hour, for a certified crew member with a chainsaw card and a hard hat and a documented 16 hours of safety training. Dorrance Fuels billed for 11 crew members, 40 to 60 hours a week, 9 months a year. Dorrance Fuels employed 4 adults. The other 7 were whichever boys Barrow put in the truck that morning. Bryce Blaylock went out on the fuels crew for the first time on his 9th day, at level 1, which meant he was allowed to be spoken to. They loaded at 5:20 in a flatbed with a stock rack. 9 boys standing, holding the rack. Barrow drove with the windows down and the radio on a classic rock station out of St. George, and he had a habit of taking the cattle guard at 40 so that everybody in the back had to catch themselves. The work was juniper. You cut, you dragged, you stacked, and the slash piles had to be a specific height and a specific distance apart because the contract specified it, and Barrow measured the piles with a stick because the contract inspector might come. He never measured the boys. They got 1-gallon jug per boy per day. High desert, 6,400 feet. June, no shade, because shade was what they were removing. Chaps for 2 of the 9, because there were only 2 pairs. Bryce dragged for 11 days. Then he ran a saw for a week, and his hands shook so hard at night he couldn't hold his spoon. And Duffy showed him how to hide it by putting both elbows on the table. He learned the accounting fast, because he was his father's son, and his father had raised him to count. He counted 41 boys on the property. He counted 4 adults on the fire line, and 7 boys, every single day. He counted that they were told, out loud, in the truck, every morning, if anybody asks, you're visiting your uncle, you're not working, you're volunteers, you're learning a trade. He counted that Barrow said this in a bored voice, like a flight attendant. And he counted the days, on the underside of the bunk rail, in pencil, 4 tally marks and a slash, which Duffy told him to keep at least 8 inches from the cuff so the inspection light wouldn't hit it. Wilkins Hollingshead was 14 years old, and everybody called him Wilk. He was from Barstow, California, and he had been raised by his grandmother, Ozella, because his mother had died when he was 6. He'd been at Bright Mesa for 5 months. He'd been sent because he'd been skipping school, and Ozella had panicked, and a woman at her church had shown her a website with a picture of a gate and a paragraph about structure, and Ozella had spent $41,000 of her late husband's pension money on it, in installments, over 5 months, which is a detail she would say out loud in a federal courtroom without crying and then have to stop. Wilk had asthma. It was on the intake form, box 14, circled, with a note about a rescue inhaler. Bright Mesa's medical protocol was administered by a physician assistant named Levon Ruddick, who visited the property one afternoon every 2 weeks and was paid $1,100 a month to be listed as medical director on the website. Ruddick's standing policy was that inhalers were commonly used for secondary gain and were to be held in the office and dispensed on request, with the request documented, because documentation protected the program. The office was 11 miles from the fire line. On a Monday in the last week of June, on a slope above a drainage called Sowerby Wash, the temperature at 2 in the afternoon was 101 degrees. Wilk had been dragging since 6. He had finished his gallon by 11. At around 1:30, he sat down on a slash pile, which is a thing you are not allowed to do, and Barrow told him to get up, and he said he couldn't breathe, and Barrow said the words that 11 boys would independently repeat to 3 different investigators over the following 2 years. He said, "You can breathe fine when you're talking." Wilk got up. He dragged for another 2 hours. He vomited twice. At 4, they loaded the truck, and at 4:40 they got back to the ranch, and Wilk couldn't get himself down off the bed of the flatbed, so Duffy Crosby and Sim Tennant lifted him down. He was cuffed to the nightline at 9:15 like everybody else. He was making a sound at 11 that Cricket Hobbs, 12 years old and 6 feet away, described to a jury as like a straw at the bottom of a cup. Bryce Blaylock yelled for the staff. He yelled for 11 minutes. There was one adult on the property overnight, a 22-year-old named Turner Paget, who had been hired 4 months earlier at $17 an hour, with no background check and no training beyond a laminated card. And Turner came in with a flashlight, and Turner did the thing that would eventually cost the Sherrod family everything. He panicked, and he called Barrow. And Barrow said, "Do not call an ambulance. I'm coming." And while he waited, Turner Paget took out his phone and, because he was 22 and terrified, and some part of him already knew what he was standing in the middle of, He took 4 photographs of a barn with 22 children, cable-locked to a rail. Barrow arrived at 11:50. Wilk Hollingshead was pronounced dead in the emergency department in Cavender at 1:52 in the morning on Tuesday, the 30th of June, and the intake note said, "Found unresponsive in bed," and the death certificate, signed by a deputy coroner named Hargis Beale, on the recommendation of Levon Ruddick, PAC, gave the cause as probable undiagnosed cardiac arrhythmia. There was no autopsy. Ozella Hollingshead was told on the phone, at 6 in the morning, by Lorene Sherrod, in the softest voice in 3 counties, that her grandson had a heart nobody knew was broken, and that God had a plan, and that the program would waive the final month's tuition. Wilk was buried 9 days later on the Mesa, in a fenced half-acre that Talmadge had registered with the county in 2019 as a private family cemetery, which is a legal instrument that in that state required no funeral director, no permit per interment, and no notification of anyone. He was the second boy in that half-acre. The other one was named Merritt Vandy, who had died in 2021, at 15, of what Levon Ruddick had described as a seizure disorder. Here is what happened at Bright Mesa Ranch in the 4 days after Wilk Hollingshead died. The boys were told he had transferred. That was the word, transferred. They had all watched him get lifted off a truck. They had all heard the sound at 11. 3 of them had watched Barrow carry him out of the barn. And on Tuesday morning at the 4:45 unlock, Talmadge Sherrod stood at the end of the nightline with his hands folded in front of him and said, "Hollingshead has been transferred to a program better suited to his needs. I'd remind you that gossip is a level 0 behavior." And 40 boys said, "Yes, sir." Brees Blaylock did not say it. He got 2 days in what the boys called the box, which was a 20-foot shipping container with a bench in it and a bucket, positioned on the east side of the machine shop so it got the morning sun. He came out of the box on Thursday, and he had decided something. You have to understand what he had to work with. 13 years old, level 1. No phone, no paper, no pencil except a stub he'd stolen from the intake clipboard. No stamp, no envelope, no address book. What he had was one thing his father had drilled into him in a truck cab 3 years earlier, while they waited for a train to pass. Thatch had made him memorize the unit's mailing address, not the house address, the address that would find him anywhere on Earth. He'd made him repeat it back on 9 separate occasions over 3 years, and Bryce had complained about it every time, and his father had said, "Someday you'll want me, and I'll be somewhere with a different name. That address is a door I can't close." So Brees wrote the letter on the back of a Bright Mesa Ranch progress report, which was the only paper on the property that a level 1 could touch, because progress reports were handed to you to sign. He wrote it in 11 minutes in the bathroom. He wrote, "Dad, they chain us at night." A boy didn't wake up on Tuesday. His name was Wilk Hollingshead. He was 14, from Barstow. He had asthma, and they wouldn't give him his inhaler. They told us he transferred. They buried him here. I saw the dirt. We cut trees for money, 11 miles west. 7 of us and 4 grown men. They tell us to say we're volunteers. There are 41 of us. Mom knows. I'm not making this up. I know what they told you I would do. I'm at level 1. Please come. Then he wrote, at the bottom, in smaller letters, because he was 13 and he was still a kid, "I'm sorry about the wall." Getting it off the mesa took 9 days and 4 people. Brees gave it to Duffy Crosby, who had 3 years of institutional knowledge and knew that the laundry went out on Wednesdays and came back Fridays and was handled by nobody at all in between. Duffy sewed it into the hem of a mattress cover, using a needle he had made from a piece of baling wire and dental floss, which is a sentence that should make every adult in this country feel something. The mattress cover went into the laundry bin. And Turner Paget, who had 4 photographs on his phone he hadn't been able to delete and hadn't been able to look at, was the one who drove the laundry into town. He found it because Duffy told him to look. Duffy walked up to him at the truck with a laundry bag and said, "Hem of the striped one," and walked away, and Turner Paget stood in a gravel lot in Cavender, Utah, for 4 minutes, with a mattress cover in his hands and his entire life on both sides of a decision. He didn't mail it himself. He was 22, not stupid. He knew that a Cavender postmark on an envelope going to a military address would be traced back to one of 6 people, and one of them was him. He drove it 310 miles to Barstow, California, on his day off. and he knocked on the door of a 71-year-old woman whose grandson's name was on the outside of the letter. And he said, "Ma'am, I worked at that ranch. I need to tell you how Wilk died, and then I need you to mail something." Ozella Hollingshead listened to all of it standing up. Then she went and got her reading glasses and a stamp, and she wrote out the address in the careful looping cursive of a woman who had been a school secretary for 31 years, and she walked it 4 blocks to the post office herself because she did not trust her own mailbox. She said one thing to Turner Paget before he left. "You'll want to be the man who tells the truth first," she said. "There's only one of those, and everybody after him is just a man who got caught." The letter reached a plywood mailroom on a compound in western Iraq, 19 days after Wilk Hollingshead was buried. Thatch was coming off a night rotation. He had 4 hours of sleep in him and a cup of coffee that tasted like the inside of a canteen, and a specialist handed him an envelope with a Barstow postmark and unfamiliar handwriting, and he opened it standing up, in a hallway, with his helmet under his arm. Men who were there say he read it 3 times. Then he set the coffee down on the floor, very carefully, and put his hand flat against the plywood wall, and stood like that for about 20 seconds. "He wasn't shaking," Master Sergeant Emerson Nolan said later. "That's what I remember. Everybody expects the shaking. He got calm in a way that made me want to leave the room." Thatch did 3 things in the next 40 minutes, in this order, and the order matters because it is the whole story of who this man is. He did not call his wife. First, he went to the communications shack, and he asked Sergeant First Class Vandy Threlkeld, who ran the troop's comms and had 11 years of doing quietly brilliant things with radios, to record his next call. Not to help him get through, to record it. Threlkeld asked no questions and set it up in 4 minutes. Second, he called Ansley. It was 2 in the afternoon in Utah. She picked up on the 4th ring, in a kitchen, with a dishwasher running. He could hear it. He asked her, in a completely level voice, where his son was. She told him Brees was at a program. A really good program. Her brother's program. He asked her if she had signed a transport authorization. She said yes. He asked her, still level, if she knew that the boys at that program were locked to a cable at night. And this is the recording. This is the 12 seconds that got played in a federal courtroom 14 months later, and in a family courtroom after that, and in the hearing where the state of Utah revoked a license that should never have been issued in the first place. Ansley Blaylock said, "Thatcher, don't be dramatic. It's a safety protocol. He's fine. It's building character." There is a pause on the recording that lasts 4 seconds. Then her husband says, "Ansley, a boy died there on Tuesday." And she says, That boy had a heart condition. Talmadge told us. You're going to hear a lot of things from Bryce. That's literally what the handbook." And Thatch says, "Say goodnight to Ruthie for me," and hangs up. Threlkeld saved the file in 2 places. Third, he went and stood outside a plywood door with a hand-lettered sign on it, and he waited 11 minutes because there was a video conference happening, and then he went in and put a piece of paper on Colonel Merritt Kirkland's desk. Kirkland was 51, a soft-spoken man from Mobile with reading glasses he was vain about not needing, and he had known Thatcher Blaylock for 14 years. He read the letter. Then he read it again, all the way through, slower. And when he got to the line about the wall, he took his glasses off and set them down and looked at the far wall of the office for a moment. Then he asked 2 questions. Is any of this checkable from here? The dead boy's name and the county cemetery filing. Yes, sir. Do you intend to do something stupid? Thatch said, No, sir. I intend to do something thorough. Kirkland sat there, what he was weighing, and he said this on the record later without apology, was that he had a man in front of him who was going home either way. The only question in front of a commander in that moment is whether the man goes home alone and unsupervised, or goes home surrounded by the most disciplined people either of them had ever met. You have 96 hours of emergency leave, Kirkland said, and 8 of my best men. They're all on block leave as of 0600 tomorrow, which means they're civilians on vacation. And what a civilian does on his vacation is between him and God. Do you understand the distinction I'm drawing, Sergeant Major? Perfectly, sir. Say it back to me. Nobody here sent anybody anywhere. Nobody here sent anybody anywhere. Kirkland handed the letter back. One more thing. You will call the bureau before you call anybody with a rifle. That is not advice, Thatch said. Sir, I was going to call the bureau from the airplane. The 8 of them came because he asked. That's the whole mechanism. There was no operation order, no funding, no authority, nothing but a text message that said, only, Utah, my kid, 4 days, and 8 men who bought their own airline tickets inside of 90 minutes. Emerson Nolan, the team sergeant, 41, 6 kids, who had never once raised his voice above the level of a man ordering breakfast. Quinlan Bragdon, 36, targeting and intelligence, a man who could build a stranger's entire life out of a business license and a Tuesday. Vandy Threlkeld, comms, the one with the recording. Fenno Sanderlin, 38, sniper and observer, who could lie in one place for 9 hours and tell you afterward how many times a particular door had opened. Fairleigh Mattingly called Doc, the troop medic, who packed 2 aid bags and a pediatric airway kit because Thatch had read him one line from the letter. Orville Stallings, engineer. Lem Yeardley, 34, driver, who had never in 9 years been more than 10 feet from Thatch on a target. And Denby Cottrell, 44, the oldest of them, who had been a breacher himself before his back gave out and who now taught it, and who said the only thing anybody said on the flight over. They were somewhere over the Atlantic, and Cottrell leaned across the aisle and said, Thatch, whatever this turns into, your boy's going to watch you do it. I know. Then do it like he's watching. They landed in Salt Lake City at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and Thatcher Blaylock started his 96-hour clock in the parking lot of a rental car counter. Hour 1, he called Holland Vandiver. Vandiver had served in the same squadron for 6 years before he'd taken a knee injury and a hard look at his life and gone to the bureau, and he was now a supervisory special agent in the Salt Lake City field office working civil rights and human trafficking. He met them in the back of a Mexican restaurant in Murray with a legal pad and a bad attitude, and the first thing he said was, before you tell me anything, I need to know if I'm hearing this as your friend or as an agent, because those are 2 different nights. Thatch pushed the letter across the table. Vandiver read it. Then he put his pen down and said, okay, I'm an agent, and I'm going to tell you the truth, which is that a letter from a kid inside a program is the single least useful piece of evidence in America. I've had 9 of these. 9. You know how many indictments? None. Because the program's lawyer walks in with an intake form the mother signed, and a handbook that says the kid will lie, and a licensing certificate from a state agency with 4 inspectors for the whole state, and it's over. It is over before it starts. What would not be over? Federal money, Vandiver said, or a body, preferably both. And Thatcher Blaylock, who had been reading structures for 21 years, put his finger on the 11th line of his son's letter. We cut trees for money 11 miles west, he read. 7 of us and 4 grown men. They tell us to say we're volunteers. Vandiver stopped moving. Who pays for tree cutting on public land in this state? Thatch asked. Oh, Vandiver said. Here's what the first 30 hours looked like, and I want you to notice that not 1 hour of it involved a weapon. Quinlan Bragdon took the business filings. In 11 hours in a hotel room with 2 laptops and a printer he'd bought at a big box store, he built the whole family out of public records. Bright Mesa Ranch, LLC. Sole managers Talmadge R. Sherrod and Cormac J. Sherrod. Safe Passage Youth Services, LLC. Cormac. Ammons Youth Wellness Group, LLC, which build private insurance and a state behavioral health program for individual therapy, 45 minutes, 4 sessions weekly, for every enrolled boy, and which employed exactly 1 licensed clinician, part-time, in Provo, who later testified that she had never physically been to the property. Dorrance Fuels and Forestry, LLC, Talmadge, holder of federal hazardous fuels reduction subcontracts totaling $1,904,000 over 5 years, and a half-acre parcel, split off in 2019 and recorded with the county recorder as a private family cemetery, on which 2 interment records existed and no death certificates matched to any funeral home. Fenno Sanderlin took the Mesa. He drove out at 2 in the morning, parked on BLM land 4 miles off, walked in, and lay down in a juniper brake 900 meters from the ranch with a spotting scope and a notebook. He stayed 31 hours. He came back with a page of times that read like a machine's heartbeat. 0445 barn door. 40 boys out in 11 minutes. 0520 flatbed loads, 9 standing. 0915, barn door, count in, 40. Gate camera 1, facing in, 2 adults overnight, and 1 line, underlined twice. 2114 audible metallic, repeated 22 times. Vandy Threlkeld took the ordinary world, and in a mother's forum he found 3 women in 3 states who had written the same sentence about the same gate, and a phone number for a woman named Glenna Sandow in Nevada, who had sued Bright Mesa in 2022 and lost, not on the facts, but because page 14 of an enrollment packet had sent her to arbitration, where she was billed $9,000 in fees and signed a settlement of $11,000 and a permanent gag. Her son had come home from that ranch at 17 and had not been right since. She talked for 2 hours, and at the end of it she said, "I've been waiting 3 years for somebody to call me who wasn't a lawyer." And Thatch drove 310 miles to Barstow, California, and sat on a plastic-covered sofa across from Ozella Hollingshead, and let her make him a sandwich he did not want, and looked at $41,000 of receipts in a shoebox, and then at a framed photograph of a 14-year-old boy in a Little League uniform. "They said his heart," she said. "Mr. Blaylock, that child ran up my stairs 11 times a day." Thatch said, "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you for something very hard. Ask it. I need your permission to have your grandson exhumed." Ozella Hollingshead was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You bring me the paper, and I'll sign it in front of the whole church." Hour 34 was a woman named Faye Ottaway in a beige government office in Cedar City, with a photograph of a burned hillside on the wall behind her. Faye Ottaway was a fuels program contract specialist with 19 years in, and she had been quietly unhappy about Dorrance Fuels and Forestry for 2 seasons, in the specific way a career civil servant is unhappy. She had written 3 memos about it and filed them. Her problem was crew composition. Dorrance's piles were always right. Their acreage numbers were always slightly high, but never impossibly high, and their crew rosters had 11 names on them. And in 19 years of contract administration, Faye Ottaway had never once managed to lay eyes on more than 4 of Talmadge Sherrod's employees. "I asked him twice for I-9s, she said. "He sent me a letter from a lawyer. Holland Vandiver put a subpoena in front of her that afternoon, and Faye Ottaway printed everything in the file, with an expression that a federal agent later described as Christmas. Here's what came out of that printer. Dorrance Fuels and Forestry had submitted, for the pay period covering the last week of June, a certified payroll, a legally required document signed under penalty of perjury in a federal contract file, listing 11 crew members and their hours. Line 7 of that document read, Hollingshead, W. Laborer, Sawyer, 61.0 hours. Wilkins Hollingshead died at 1:52 on Tuesday morning, the 30th of June. The pay period ran through Saturday, the 4th of July. They had billed the United States government for 61 hours of labor from a 14-year-old boy, 36 of which occurred after he was dead, and they had done it because Talmadge Sherrod's system generated crew rosters from the enrollment list, and nobody had updated the enrollment list because Wilk hadn't been discharged. He'd been buried. Thatch was standing next to the printer when it came out. Vandiver told him afterward that he read the line, and read it again, and then said only, "There it is." "There what is?" "The door." He tapped the paper. "Everything they built is a lie about what's inside. This is the hinge. I want to be specific about why that one line ended the Sherrod family, because it's the most useful thing in this entire story. Everything else they had done was hidden inside a fortress the industry built for itself over 30 years. Parental consent, arbitration clauses, gag settlements, a licensing agency with 4 inspectors for the whole state, and a handbook that pre-discredited every child. A boy's testimony went into that fortress and died. But a certified payroll in a federal contract file is a different universe. It isn't a program record. It's a claim on the public treasury, signed under penalty of perjury, and there is no arbitration clause on earth that can move a false claim against the United States into a private conference room. Thatcher Blaylock did not find a way to prove the Sherrods were cruel. He found the place where their cruelty had touched a system that does not care about consent forms. By hour 41, an assistant United States attorney named Verity Lindell had been pulled out of a Wednesday evening barbecue and was sitting in a conference room with her hair still wet, reading Bragdon's binder. She was blunt about the shape of it. Forced labor and false claims were the spine. The chaining was the color. The dead boy was the reason a judge would sign anything at speed, but only if she had something better than a 14-year-old's cause of death certificate signed by a physician assistant on the payroll of the people who'd buried him. "I need the inside," she said. "I need a staff member, somebody who was there at night." Which is when Thatch said, "I have 4 photographs, and I know who took them." Turner Paget was found at 9:40 that night, in the parking lot of a supermarket in Cavender, sitting in a Corolla, eating cereal out of the box. He'd quit Bright Mesa 11 days earlier. He had not slept properly since the last week of June. He had, on his phone, 4 photographs of the Nightline, 1 video of a slash pile crew that showed 6 boys and 1 adult, and, because he had been the guy who did the paperwork nobody else wanted to do, screenshots of the crew assignment spreadsheet for 19 consecutive weeks, showing which boys went out on which day. That spreadsheet, cross-matched against a federal certified payroll, is not evidence of a crime. It is a confession with a header row. Thatch didn't approach him. He'd learned something in 21 years about who should walk up to a frightened 22-year-old, and it wasn't a 6'2" sergeant major with forearms. Doc Mattingly went. Doc had 4 kids and a face like a Labrador, and he sat on the hood of the Corolla and said, "You're the one that stayed with him, aren't you? In the barn. You stayed." Turner Paget cried for a while. Then he said, "I called Barrow. I should have called an ambulance and I called Barrow." "Yeah," Doc said. "Here's the thing about that. You're the only person on that whole mesa who said that sentence out loud. Everybody else is still lying. Which one do you want to be for the next 50 years? Turner Paget was in a federal building in Salt Lake City at 7 the next morning with a lawyer appointed for him, and he talked for 6 hours. He gave them the Nightline policy in Talmadge's own handwriting. He gave them the sentence Barrow said on the slope. He gave them the box, and the 2-week PA visits, and the fact that the therapy sessions being billed 4 times a week were a group meeting on Sunday nights run by Lorene Sherrod, out of a book, with no clinician present, ever. He gave them Merritt Vandy, the boy who died in 2021, and where he was buried, and the fact that Talmadge had had the ground blessed by a pastor from Cavender so that the half-acre would read, on paper, as a family plot. And he gave them the thing Verity Lindell actually needed, which was the reason a judge signed a warrant at 11 at night. He told them the Sherrods were opening a second one. Ammon's Youth Wellness had leased 400 acres and a set of ranch buildings outside Pahranagat, Nevada. Talmadge had been calling it Phase 2 for a year, and 2 weeks after Wilk Hollingshead died, Cormac Sherrod had put a deposit on 2 used 40-passenger school buses. Verity Lindell went to a magistrate judge on Thursday night with a 140-page affidavit, and she came out at 11:50 with search warrants for the ranch, the machine shop, the office, and the cemetery parcel, an exhumation order for Wilkins Hollingshead, and arrest warrants for Talmadge, Cormac, and Barrow Sherrod, Levon Ruddick, and Merrill Kilbourne. Execution was set for 6 a.m. Friday, because that's how it's done. You go at dawn, with a child welfare team, with an ambulance staged, with a plan, so that 41 children are not extracted from a building in the dark by strangers with rifles. It was the right call. Everybody in the room agreed it was the right call. Hour 79. The last piece was the sheriff, and the sheriff was the reason the plan came apart. Aldrich Sowerby had been sheriff of Ammons County for 19 years. Bright Mesa had donated to every one of his campaigns. His brother-in-law drove one of Cormac's transport vans, and he had personally answered 3 abuse referrals from 3 school districts by driving out, talking to Talmadge for 40 minutes, drinking coffee, and writing unfounded. Verity Lindell did not notify him. Federal warrants don't require it. But somebody in the county courthouse in Cavender did, because a magistrate's clerk had a cousin, because in a county of 9,000 people, everybody is somebody's cousin. And that is how Talmadge Sherrod came to be standing in his office at 11:40 on Thursday night, 90 minutes after the warrants were signed, knowing. Fenno Sanderlin, 900 meters out in the juniper on his 31st hour, watched the office light come on and keyed his radio. Movement. Office light. 2 vehicles inbound, fast. Thatch was in a hotel room in Cedar City with a map on the bed. 9 men, 1 map. 4 hours before a federal warrant was supposed to be served. At 11:52, Sanderlin said, "Barn's opening. They're loading the boys." Nobody in that hotel room said anything for about 3 seconds, because everybody in it understood exactly what was happening. In 4 hours, 60 federal agents were going to arrive at Bright Mesa Ranch with a warrant, an ambulance, and a child welfare team, and they were going to find 41 empty bunks and a cut cable, and every one of those boys was going to be 400 miles away on 400 leased acres in Nevada under a different LLC with a different name, and there is no warrant on earth for a building nobody has told you about yet. Turner Paget had given them one sentence that nobody had followed up on, because it hadn't seemed urgent at the time. There's a driveway camera at the gate. It only faces in. Tal never cared who was coming. He cared who was leaving. Thatch called Holland Vandiver first. That was Colonel Kirkland's one instruction, and he honored it to the second. "They're loading buses right now," he said. 2 40-passenger buses. You cannot get a team there in 4 hours, and you know it. Vandiver said, "Do not go up there." Holland, "Thatcher, if you go up there, a defense attorney gets to spend a year telling a jury this whole case is a soldier's revenge. Everything Lindell built dies. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" And Thatcher Blaylock said the sentence that Verity Lindell would later quote in her closing argument, because it turned out to be the most legally significant thing anybody said that night. He said, "Then don't send me. Deputize me. I'm the parent of a child being transported across a state line by the people you have a warrant for, and I'm going to be standing in the road. Send me one agent, one camera, and a sheriff who isn't Sowerby." Vandiver was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Utah Highway Patrol has a sergeant in Beaver I trust with my life. I'll be 40 minutes behind you. And Thatch, every one of your guys keeps their hands empty and their body cameras running. Every one. If one man on that mesa touches a firearm tonight, they walk." "Not one of us brought one," Thatch said. "We brought bolt cutters. There are 2 ways to tell what happened on Dorrance Mesa between midnight and sunrise, and the honest one is the boring one, because the boring one is what actually beat them. 9 men, 3 rented vehicles, plus a water truck, no firearms. 9 body cameras bought that afternoon at a farm supply store for $89 apiece, and a 10th camera on the dashboard of a Utah Highway Patrol cruiser driven by a sergeant named Ellis Van Wyck, who had been asleep in Beaver 90 minutes earlier and who spent the drive out saying the same sentence into his radio over and over. "I need everybody to understand these are children." Thatcher Blaylock's plan had 3 parts, and he briefed it in the parking lot in 90 seconds. Part 1. Nothing leaves. 11 miles of county gravel with 1 hard point on it, and Thatch had spent 4 days looking at satellite imagery of that hard point, which was a cattle guard over a wash a mile and a half below the ranch, with cut banks on both sides 4 feet high. You cannot drive a 40-passenger school bus around a cattle guard in a wash. You cannot drive one over a water truck parked lengthwise across it either. Orville Stallings had rented the water truck at 4 that afternoon from a company in Parowan for $300 and a card imprint, and had spent the evening not knowing why. He knew why at 12:21, when he put 4,000 gallons of dead weight across a cattle guard, took the keys, dropped them down the front of his shirt, and sat on the hood. Part 2. The gate. The gate was the thing Talmadge Sherrod loved most in the world. $9,000 of welded steel pipe and 1/4-inch plate. It was the photograph on the brochure. It was in the video on the website behind an actor in a gray shirt, looking wistfully at a sunrise. And the reason Thatcher Blaylock went at the gate first, instead of driving around the fence, and you could have driven around that fence in a golf cart, it was 4-strand barbed wire, was not tactics. It was that 41 children were lying awake in a dark barn listening to men load buses, and every one of them had been told, on his first night, the story about the boy who ran and lost his fingers. Every one of them had been taught for months or years that the gate was the edge of the world and that nothing came through it. They needed to hear it go, Thatch said, on the stand, when a defense attorney asked him why he hadn't simply cut the wire. Those kids had been living inside a story about a gate. Somebody had to end the story out loud. He didn't blow it. He had no explosives, and he was a man on emergency leave in his own country, and he had been extremely clear with 8 men in a parking lot that nobody was going to do a single thing that couldn't be shown to a jury frame by frame. He did it the way a breacher does it, which is with mathematics and a truck. The gate was a swing gate on 2 8-inch pipe posts set in concrete. and it was chained shut with a 3/8 chain and a padlock, and the whole assembly was, structurally, a lever with its weakest point at the hinge weld. Thatch put a toe strap on the free end, at the height of the middle rail, not the top. The top would have twisted and held, and Lem Yeardley put the rental truck in low and rolled forward at about 4 miles an hour. It didn't explode. It didn't fly. It groaned, and the weld at the lower hinge tore with a sound like a bell being dropped, and $9,000 of Talmadge Sherrod's identity lay down flat in the gravel with the ranch name face up in the headlights. 41 boys in a barn a quarter-mile away heard it. Bryce Blaylock, 13 years old, ankle cuffed to a rail because they had cuffed them again while they waited for the buses to be fueled, sat up in the dark and said, out loud, to nobody, "That's my dad." Part 3. And this was the whole thing. The part Thatch had drilled into 8 men who had spent their careers doing the opposite. Nobody runs. Nobody shouts. Nobody touches a Sherrod. They will hand us the case if we behave, he said. They will take it back if we don't. We are 9 unarmed civilians, with cameras and a court order coming behind us. Our entire job is to be extremely boring and extremely immovable. So 9 men walked up a gravel driveway at 12:26 in the morning with their hands visible, calling out, "Nolan," on a loudspeaker from the truck, the same flat voice he'd used to order breakfast. "Federal search warrant is being served at 0600. Highway patrol is on scene. Nothing is leaving this property. Nobody needs to get hurt." Cormac Sherrod met them in the yard with a shotgun. He got about 8 words out. Something about private property. And Denby Cottrell, 44 years old, the oldest man there, stopped walking, spread his empty hands, and said, "Sir, there are 9 cameras on you, and a state trooper 2 minutes out, and there are 41 children behind you. You are 3 seconds from being the most famous man in Utah. Put it down, and be a guy who cooperated." Cormac Sherrod looked at the 9 of them. He put it down. That is the whole confrontation. It is not cinematic, and it is the most impressive thing in this story, because every single one of those men had spent 2 decades being paid to solve that exact problem the other way, and they didn't, because a 13-year-old was watching. The buses were the argument that mattered. Barrow Sherrod had one of them running with 11 boys already loaded, and Thatch walked to the front of it and stood on the cattle guard road with his hands at his sides while Barrow revved it, and Barrow rolled it forward until the bumper was against Thatch's thighs, and Thatch did not move. Fenno Sanderlin's body camera has 41 seconds of that. It has been played, at this point, in 3 courtrooms and 1 legislative hearing. Barrow put it in park and got out and started swinging a 2-foot bolt cutter. Now, I promised you this man was a professional, so here is what a professional does, and it took 1.5 seconds. Thatch stepped inside the arc, because a swinging tool has an arc, and inside the arc there is nothing. Took the cutter across his forearm and turned it out of Barrow's hands with a motion that Doc Mattingly later described as, like taking a rake off a kid. Put Barrow Sherrod face down in the gravel, and knelt on his shoulder blade. Then he said, on camera, "You're not hurt. Stay still, and you'll stay not hurt." And he did not hit him, not once. 21 years, 400 doors. A man who had every reason on this earth, and the video shows him with his hands flat and open on a man's back, breathing, waiting for a trooper. Barrow Sherrod screamed at him from the gravel for a while, and then he screamed something at the barn, in Spanish, and then in English, and what he yelled was the name of one of the 4 adults still inside. At 12:41 in the morning, the stock barn caught fire. It caught at the north end, in a tack room, where there was a 5-gallon can of 2-stroke mix for the saws, and 19 weeks of crew assignment sheets, and a 3-ring binder with a handwritten nocturnal accountability log going back 4 years. It was not an accident, and nobody has ever seriously pretended it was. A jury took 90 minutes on that count. 32 boys were already out in the yard. 9 were not, because the buses had been loading in shifts, and the cable had been relocked, and the man with the key had run for a truck. Here is where the 21 years actually mattered. Not the gate, not the bolt cutter. Thatch went through the personnel door on the south side, which was locked, and he did not stop to think about it, because he had spent 2 decades not needing to think about it. He read it in the dark by feel in about a second and a half. Hollow metal door, cheap latch, hinges inside, jam spread already from 100 slammings. and he took it off the latch with one boot, at the exact height where the strike plate met the wood, which is not kicking, it is measuring, with your foot, at speed. Then 5 men went into a burning barn with bolt cutters and pulled 9 children off a cable. Aircraft cable does not cut easily. It's 4-strand galvanized, and a 2-foot bolt cutter will do it, but it takes a body's whole weight, and there were 9 cuffs and about 4 minutes of usable air at floor level. Lem Yeardley cut 4. Doc Mattingly cut 2 while sitting on the concrete with a 12-year-old named Cricket Hobbs in his lap. Denby Cottrell cut 1 and then couldn't close the handles again because of his back and yelled for help, and Orville Stallings did the next. The 9th was Brees Blaylock, at the far end, in the smoke, and his father got to him and put a hand on his chest and said, "Hey, hold still." And Brees said, "Dad, do Duffy first, he's got the asthma one now." 9 seconds. That's how long that argument lasted, and Thatch lost it, because his son was right. Duffy Crosby had inherited Will Hollingshead's rescue inhaler in the way that things are inherited in a place like that, which is to say he had it in his sock and it was empty. Thatch cut Duffy Crosby's cuff first, then his son's. Then Brees Blaylock, 13 years old, took the bolt cutters out of his father's hands, because there was one more, a boy named Sim Tennant, who was 230 pounds, and had gone down on the concrete, and was not helping. And Brees couldn't lift him, but he could cut, and he did, with both hands and his whole weight, the way his father had unconsciously taught him by letting him hold the tape on a drywall patch. Everybody came out of that barn, every single one. 2 boys and Doc Mattingly went to the hospital in Cedar City for smoke inhalation and were discharged the next day. The barn burned for 6 hours. It took the machine shop with it, and the tack room, and the office annex, and the nocturnal accountability log, which Barrow Sherrod had lit it to destroy, not knowing that a 22-year-old with a Corolla and a guilty conscience had photographed 40 pages of it 11 days earlier, and that those photographs were already in a federal building in Salt Lake City with a Bates stamp on them. Talmadge Sherrod was found at 4:15 in the morning, sitting in the pilot's seat of a 1978 Cessna 182, at the end of a dirt strip on the west shoulder of the mesa, with a duffel bag containing $81,000 in cash, 2 passports, and a folder of deeds. The airplane would not start. Fenno Sanderlin had pulled the battery ground strap at 9 o'clock the previous evening, 31 hours into an observation post, while everybody else was still writing an affidavit, because Sanderlin had spent 31 hours watching a man walk out to look at an airplane 4 separate times, and had drawn the obvious conclusion, and had done one quiet thing about it. 60 federal agents, 4 ambulances, 2 child welfare teams, and a state fire marshal arrived at 6 a.m. Friday to serve a warrant on a property that was already on fire, already secured, and already empty of children, all 41 of whom were sitting on the far side of a cattle guard, on and around a water truck, wrapped in emergency blankets, being counted for the 2nd time by a man with a notebook. Holland Vandiver got out of his car, looked at the whole scene for a while, and said, "Sergeant Major, anything I need to be unhappy about?" Thatch handed him 9 body cameras in a plastic grocery bag. "Every second of it," he said. "Nobody laid a hand on anybody but me, and I did it once." The sun came up on Dorrance Mesa at 6:12. What it came up on was a rectangle of ash where a stock barn had been, 4 county fire engines that had arrived too late to do anything but wet the ground, a flattened gate lying face up in the gravel with the ranch name still legible on it, and an airplane with the cowling open and a 52-year-old man sitting in the back of a federal vehicle looking at nothing. Bright Mesa Ranch never operated again, not for one day. Its license was suspended at 9:40 that morning by a state agency that had inspected the property twice in 6 years, both times by appointment. The buildings that hadn't burned were condemned by the county building official at 2 in the afternoon, because with the machine shop gone, there was no potable water system and no functioning septic for a residential facility, which meant that the entire legal existence of the place had depended on a well pump in a shed that Barrow Sherrod had personally set on fire. Both LLCs were seized. The 400 acres in Nevada went into a receivership before the deposit cleared on the second bus. By sunrise, the ranch didn't exist. They did that part themselves. Wilkins Hollingshead came out of the ground on the following Tuesday. Ozella Hollingshead stood at the fence line in a blue dress with her purse in both hands, and she had asked for exactly one thing, which was that nobody put a tarp up, because she said her grandson had spent 5 months being hidden, and she was finished with that. The state medical examiner performed the autopsy in Salt Lake City the same day. Cause of death: heat stroke, with exertional rhabdomyolysis and an acute asthma exacerbation as contributing factors. Manner of death: homicide. There was no cardiac abnormality of any kind. The report contains one sentence that Verity Lindell read to the jury slowly, twice. The decedent's heart is anatomically and histologically normal. Levon Ruddick, PAC, who had never examined the body, had written probable undiagnosed cardiac arrhythmia because Talmud Sherrod told him what the diagnosis was going to be. On the phone, at 2 a.m, in a call that existed in Ruddick's own carrier records, and which he had forgotten about for a full year until an FBI agent slid a page across a table. Merritt Vandy came out of the ground 3 weeks later, and that one was worse, because he had been in the Mesa for 4 years. What the medical examiner could still determine was that the 15-year-old had 11 healed rib fractures in 3 different stages of healing and a healed spiral fracture of the left forearm, and that seizure disorder appeared nowhere in his medical history except on a death certificate signed by a physician assistant. The federal case was called United States v. Sherrod, and it ran 41 days. It was built on the boring things. It was built on a certified payroll that billed the government for 61 hours of a dead child's labor. It was built on 19 weeks of crew assignment spreadsheets, on a nocturnal accountability log photographed by a 22-year-old, on 406 billing claims for individual therapy sessions that no clinician had ever attended, submitted by an entity whose entire clinical staff was a woman in Provo who had never been to the property, on 4 photographs, on a bank record showing a $9,000 gate, and it was built on the boys, 31 of whom testified, which the defense had assumed would be impossible. They had built their whole fortress on the idea that a child's word is worth nothing. And then 31 children walked into a federal courtroom one at a time and gave the same times, the same distances, the same sentence in the truck every morning. You're volunteers, you're learning a trade, and the same words on a slope above Sowerby Wash. 11 separate boys, in 11 separate examinations, without ever having discussed it, quoted Barrow Sherrod saying, "You can breathe fine when you're talking." Talmud Sherrod was convicted on 31 counts, including forced labor, conspiracy, false claims against the United States, and healthcare fraud. He got life without parole, and the judge's remarks at sentencing ran 9 minutes and included the sentence, "You did not lose control of an institution, Mr. Sherrod. You designed one." Barrow Sherrod was convicted of felony murder in the death of Wilkins Hollingshead, 41 counts of child abuse, arson of a structure occupied by 9 children, and forced labor. 45 years to life. Cormac Sherrod took a plea at day 19 and testified against both brothers. 30 years. Lorene Sherrod, 74 years old, was convicted of healthcare fraud for 406 billed therapy sessions she had run out of a paperback book on Sunday nights, and of conspiracy. 8 years. She read a statement in court about how much she had loved those boys. Duffy Crosby, 16 by then, was in the gallery, and afterward a reporter asked him what he thought of it, and he said, "She's the one who taught us to say grateful." Levon Ruddick, 22 years and the loss of a license in 3 states. Merrill Kilborn, the transport driver, 11 years. Aldrich Sowerby, sheriff of Ammons County for 19 years, was convicted of deprivation of rights under color of law and obstruction, 14 years. 3 of his old unfounded reports were read aloud at his trial by the school counselors who had filed them. Fitz Ledford, who drafted the enrollment packets, was disbarred and served 26 months, and the arbitration clause he wrote was voided in all 209 contracts it appeared in, which meant Glenna Sandow got her lawsuit back after 3 years and won it. Turner Paget pleaded guilty to failure to report and to a count of misprision, and served 14 months, and at his sentencing hearing, Ozella Hollingshead, the grandmother of the boy he had failed to call an ambulance for, sat in the second row and asked the judge for leniency, and got it. She wrote him a letter every month he was inside. She still does. And Ansley Blaylock. She was charged federally as an accessory and with making a false statement. and she took a plea. And the 12 seconds Vandy Threlkeld recorded on a satellite phone in a plywood hallway in Iraq were played at her sentencing, and at her custody hearing, and in the state licensing proceeding. It's building character. She got 6 years. She lost her parental rights to both children in a hearing that took an afternoon. The judge cited the transport authorization signed at 11:41 at night, the daughter's testimony, and the fact that she had been informed of a child's death and had repeated the family's explanation for it to her husband 19 days later without ever once asking a question. Thatcher Blaylock visited her exactly one time before sentencing, at her lawyer's request. She cried and said she'd been manipulated by her mother her whole life, which was true, and that she'd thought she was helping, which she may have believed. She said she would spend the rest of her life earning her way back, and she asked him if there was any world in which he could forgive her. He said, probably, in about 20 years, when it doesn't cost anybody anything. And then he said the 9 words he had been carrying since a hallway in Iraq, and he said them without any heat at all, which is what made them unsurvivable. You were the door I never thought to check. Then he got up and left, and he has not spoken to her since, and he has never once said a bad word about her in front of either of his children, because he told Doc Mattingly that his kids were going to need somewhere to put their mother eventually, and he was not going to be the one who decided where. He retired at 22 years and 4 months. The forfeiture, 1,600 acres, the airplane, the trucks, the Nevada parcel, $1,900,000, clawed back out of a federal contract, and the $81,000 in a duffel bag, went into a court-administered restitution fund for the 41 boys of Bright Mesa Ranch and the families of the 2 who did not come home. It is not enough. It is never enough. Duffy Crosby used his to finish high school in 11 months and get a commercial driver's license, and he hauls water in Nevada now, and he calls Thatch on the first Sunday of every month, which nobody asked him to do. Cricket Hobbs, who was 12 on that concrete floor, was placed with a maternal aunt in Oregon, and is 19 now and studying to be a respiratory therapist, and if you need a minute after that sentence, take one. The gate went to the FBI's evidence facility and then, after the appeals ran out, to a scrapyard in Cedar City, where it was cut into pieces, 41 pieces. Ozella Hollingshead's idea. Every boy got one, and 2 were mailed to 2 families, and Ozella asked for hers to be the piece with the letter B on it. Exhibit 1A was 61 feet of aircraft cable, with 22 ankle cuffs crimped into it at even intervals. When Verity Lindell walked it into the courtroom coiled on a hand truck, the judge called a 15-minute recess without explaining why. Utah passed a law about it 2 years later. 22 states have some version now, and the good ones all have the same 4 things in them. And every one of those 4 things exists because of what a 13-year-old wrote in 11 minutes in a bathroom. Unannounced inspections, a mandatory outside call for every child every week that no staff member may listen to, a ban on mechanical restraint as a routine overnight measure, and a rule that a child's death in a youth program requires an autopsy by the state, not a signature by the program's own doctor. They call it the Hollingshead Standard in 3 states. Ozella asked for that. It was the only thing she ever asked for. Brees Blaylock is 19 now. He is not a soldier, and his father is openly relieved about it. He's an apprentice millwright in Boise, and he still has, taped inside the lid of his toolbox, a photocopy of a Bright Mesa Ranch progress report with pencil on the back of it. His dad framed the original. It's in a hallway in a house in Idaho with a good lock on the door and a spare key with Ruthie's name on the tag. The last thing I'll tell you about them is small. About 6 months after all of it, Thatch was hanging a new exterior door on that house, and Bryce came out to hold it, and his father handed him a folding rule and stepped back. "Measure it," he said. "Dad, it's just a door. Nothing is ever just a door," Thatcher Blaylock said. "Everything that holds is holding something. Measure it, and then tell me what it's for." Nathan again. "I want to leave you with the thing that actually stayed with me while I was putting this together, and it isn't the gate. It's that Thatcher Blaylock did not win because he was dangerous. He was dangerous the whole time, and it never helped him once. He won because he understood, faster than the people who were counting on his rage, that a cruel institution is always attached to something bigger than itself. A bank, an insurer, a licensing board, a government contract. and that the attachment point is always where it's weakest. He didn't attack the ranch. He found the one place where the ranch had touched a system that doesn't accept a signed consent form as an answer, and he pulled there. 3 things worth carrying out of this. 1. Consent obtained by fear is not consent. Ansley Blaylock signed 91 pages at 11:40 at night with her mother on speakerphone, and every one of those pages was designed for exactly that moment. If a program's paperwork tells you in advance that your child will lie about mistreatment, you are not reading a safety warning, you are reading a confession. 2. Whoever tells the truth first is the only one who gets to be a person in the story. Turner Paget did not do the right thing. He did the second right thing, 4 days late, and it still changed everything, and he served 14 months instead of 30 years. There is almost always a version of you that is late and still counts. Do not let the fact that you already failed convince you to keep failing. 3, and this is the one I'd underline. Check the doors in your own house, not the locks, the people. Thatch had 181 seconds where he stood in a barn looking at a cable with 22 cuffs on it and knew. And he spent them being polite, because seeing it would have cost him his marriage, his in-laws, his whole idea of his own life. That cost came anyway. It always does. It just came with a 14-year-old boy from Barstow attached to it. If something in your family makes a sound you can't explain, go look at it while it's cheap. Thanks for staying to the end. If this one got you, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would have done with 96 hours.